sometimes it's better not to know what's waiting for you in the dark. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. So today I wanted to do a review of Adrian Tchaikovsky's newest book, Shroud. This just came out in late February in the UK. I think it isn't going to be published in the US until June of 2025, but being in India, I'm able to import the UK copy, and this was incredible. Now let me say first off, I didn't have any plans to read this right now. I had all these plans for March, and Shroud was not involved in those plans. However, as soon as it came out and it was available to me, I bought a copy. I wanted it on the back burner just in case. And as the month wore on, it was always sitting there like looking at me from the sidelines. And a friend of mine, Alex, who I read all of Adrian Tchaikovsky's Tyrant Philosopher series with, I knew he was having a little bit of a book slump. So I said, you know what, now is the perfect time to read this book. And I got in touch with him, and he had already agreed and had started it the day before. So we've been buddy reading Shroud together. And I have to say, I had a great time with this. So I have only read Adrian Tchaikovsky's Tyrant Philosopher series, and I know I need to read the Children of Time series. I'm planning to. I have a buddy read lined up for April to start the first one, and I'll probably go from there. So I'm going to read it. And of course, his Shadow of the App series as well, which is about 10 novels long. Those are all in my TBR. They're going to happen. But I was excited to read a new standalone from him, and a standalone that is a horror. So it's a sci-fi horror. And so I jumped at the chance to read this, and I'm really excited to talk about it. Now, let me start by saying there won't be any spoilers in this. You know, I think that the copy on the back actually spoils the first section a little bit more than I want to. I definitely will not spoil it any more than is already in the copy. I'm going to try to spoil it less that's in the copy. So if you really want to read it and you want to know nothing going in, I wouldn't even read the back copy because that gives away a little bit of the first section. I think more than you need to know going into it. So this is a sci-fi horror novel that's really a survivalist horror novel, right? So the premise is, takes place in the far future after we've destroyed Earth. Earth is no longer habitable due to, as Adrian Tchaikovsky likes to remind us, human greed and capitalism, basically, have extracted and exploited all of Earth's resources and made it impossible to live there. And so we have developed the technology to spread out across the galaxy, and our main crew are aboard a ship that are strip mining different moons and different celestial bodies. So the crew that we meet in the first section is the special projects who are looking at this moon that they have nicknamed Shroud, and they're doing the research necessary to figure out how to extract as many resources from this moon as possible. And then things happen, and some of our crew members end up on this incredibly hostile environment, and then the story becomes a story of survival, of them being able to try to get off this hostile planet and get back to their crew. So that is the premise. So it's very much a survival story in space. What I really love about it is the world building is exquisite. Now, when I say world building, I mean it in more than one way. The conceptual world building, so why our characters are where they are, the way humanity has exploited Earth, and the way capitalism and oligarchies and people with money and power control everything, to the extent that workers, when they're not useful, get put into a deep sleep so that you don't have to feed them or give them recreational time, that they don't take up as much resources when they're in hibernation. So that is how workers are viewed in this economy, right? In this world that we've created. So the conceptual way that he's done this world building and the circumstances that our characters find themselves in, that I think is just really smart, and it's subtle. He doesn't beat you over the head with it, but it's all very, very clear. But then on top of that, just the actual world. So he goes to great lengths to discuss first off the ship they're on and what the details of the ship are and how the science works of the ship. But then from there, this planet, what he's done is, it's actually a moon. It's not a planet, but you know, it's a celestial body. And for these purposes, it's serving as a planet because it has a whole ecosystem or multiple ecosystems within it. He describes all of the environmental variables. It's too far away from any star, so there's literally no sunlight on it. The atmosphere is incredibly dense and almost liquid. The gravity is 1.8 times the gravity of Earth. The chemical makeup, there's no oxygen. There's no free oxygen anywhere. It's very hydrogen rich. It's always like the warmest it gets is around negative 30 degrees Celsius, and all these things. He goes to great lengths to describe what the environmental variables are of this moon, and then as a result of that, then the type of life forms, the flora and fauna that exist on this moon, and how it interacts with humans, and then the type of spacecraft the humans would need to traverse this moon, the type of drones they need, the type of technology they need. It all is really delicately thought out. It's done so skillfully that you can't help but being drawn into it. So there is an element of like a hard science element, far more so than obviously in his fantasy series, Tyrant Philosophers, but even I've been told the hard science element is more so than in his Children of Time series as well. So it leans into the science, but by doing that, it really creates this robust world that you feel like you are part of. So I think the world building is exquisite. The writing, now, again, I don't have a lot of experience with Tchaikovsky. I've only read 3 of his novels so far. But the writing is very different in this. It's almost entirely from one character's point of view. So the plotting and the writing and the setup all kind of work together. The story has, I think, 7 main sections, and each section has 6 or 7 chapters within it. And within those chapters, the vast majority of them are from one character's point of view. And then sometimes there's maybe 1 or 2 chapters per section from the alien's point of view. And those are the only 2 points of view chapters you get. But then in between each section, there's an interlude. And the interlude is from some sort of omniscient character's point of view. It seems to be from the side of the aliens, and it's describing the evolution of life on this planet in little bits and pieces. And those really worked for me. In the regular chapters, you don't get as much as Tchaikovsky's dry, kind of sardonic wit and his humor that I found in his other writing. Because it is so focused on a singular character's point of view, and there isn't as much of narrator or omniscient discussion behind the scenes, it's really emotion driven, and you don't have the same kind of humor. But then when you get these little interludes, Tchaikovsky just reminds you, that he is there behind the pen. And so I think the interludes are really, really kind of cheeky, and they pull everything together in a really beautiful way. And so the writing is structured in such a way to always keep you invested. And, when the chapters are divided between the human character and the alien character, they're labeled as light and dark. And the reason is, on this planet, there's no light. The aliens have no sense organs to see. They communicate entirely through radio waves and other frequencies. And the humans are able to understand that is how they communicate, that is how the aliens are having conversations with one another, but they can't interpret it. There's no algorithm they can design and they don't have the computing power to analyze what is being said in these conversations between the aliens and to try to interpret it in any way, to translate it into a language that they're able to understand. And so the chapters are divided as light or dark because our characters are vision based, and so we need light to interpret the world. But the alien characters live in darkness only, but they don't understand that experience of darkness because their world is filled with noise, but it's just not noise that is processed the same way we process noise or the same way we process visual input. And even exploring that in those different chapters and the way we make sense of the world through our sensory input, I think Tchaikovsky does a really good job of trying to explore what it would be like if instead of using visual input, you only had these radio waves, basically sonar. But what if your sonar wasn't a sense that then allowed you to interpret the world, but it was a sense that was your thinking? Where is the distinction between your sonar and your thought process? And if there's no distinction between those, what would your life be like? What would it be like to be that kind of organism? And so the writing itself is very crisp. It is very straightforward. And what I really appreciated about it is that, like I said, it doesn't have the humor that I kind of expected and I wanted a little bit of. But what it does have is emotion. And what it also does is it builds on itself. I think the whole story builds on itself in a really beautiful way, insofar as that, at first things are boring and mundane before, our inciting incident happens. And then when our characters are stuck on this planet, all of a sudden everything's panicked. And then they think maybe they can resolve it, and then they're meeting different obstacles on the way, as what happens in survival horror, right? And their sense of panic, their sense of emotional distress is building, obviously, as the book progresses. And as a result of that, the writing style changes. Because we have this intimate writing style, that the writing changes with our character's mood and with our character's experience. That is done really, really well. And so at the very beginning, I will say it was a little bit dry. The whole first section, before the inciting incident, when our characters are all on the space station and he's really setting up the parameters of what this world is and why our characters are there and what the consequences and the stakes are, it's almost a little clinical. It's holding you at arm's length. But then once there is this inciting incident that happens and our characters end up on the planet and their crewmates don't necessarily even know if they're alive or not, right? So the hope of being saved or being rescued is totally out of the picture. They have to do it on their own. Once you get put into that situation, then all of a sudden the story grips you and it pulls you in and it just snowballs and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. as the stakes get higher and higher and higher, and as the emotional distress gets greater and greater and greater. So the writing parallels our character's experience, which I think is done really, really well. One thing the story does in its plotting and its pacing is it avoids some of the pitfalls that you get in survival horror or survival stories in general, which is you can see how the characters have to get from point A to point B, and hypothetically point B is some sort of rescue or salvation or something, right? And to get from point A to point B, they have to have various obstacles. And then they overcome one obstacle, then they meet a new obstacle, then they overcome that obstacle and meet another obstacle, and so on until they get to the end point of their journey. And that is how most survival horror goes. But if it isn't pulled together well, then it just feels like all these little side missions that don't add up to anything. It just feels convenient. Oh, we solved this. Oh no, now this is happening. Like, it doesn't feel genuine. But here what he does is each new obstacle they face feels iterative of the one before. So it isn't just like separate obstacles that could have happened to them in any order. What happens is when they're able to overcome an obstacle, the new obstacle they face directly builds off of where they are now, the new things they've learned, the new damage they've taken, the new psychological distress they've experienced. It builds off of that. So the obstacles and then the way they navigate those obstacles is iterative. So you see our characters evolving and the landscape evolving around them as the story progresses, and because of that, it never feels boring. You never feel trapped, like you could just take any of these little mini quests and rearrange the order and it wouldn't make a difference. It never feels like that. It feels like it's growing. And so the writing and the plotting and the pacing, I think, goes really far, especially after that first chapter. Like I said, the first section takes a little while to get going because it's really setting the parameters and it's setting up what is going to happen. But once you are on Shroud, this planet, and once you are interacting with the Shrouded, which is what they call the aliens there, then the ball really starts rolling and it doesn't stop once it starts. And it feels very fluid, right? It doesn't feel piecemeal at that point, which is something that can happen in survival horror. So Tchaikovsky manages to avoid that. And if it was just that, just this survival horror, I think that would be fun. That would be good enough, right? But what he's doing is he's exploring a lot of really interesting ideas. As I said, the whole reason they're there is to strip mine this moon for resources, right? It's all about resources and money and power. And that is the goal of their operation. That's the whole reason they exist. And they even say like they wouldn't know what to do with themselves if they didn't have a job to do. That's why they get put into hibernation, because they're not worth anything to anyone unless their labor is being exploited, regardless of how specialized their labor may or may not be. They exist for their labor to be exploited. That's it. And within that, obviously, you have these ideas of colonization and of xenophobia, and what does it mean to be engaging in alien life, especially if that alien life is sentient or has higher sentience. Then what does it mean to just strip mine their planets and totally ignore the fauna that exist in this ecosystem or in this habitat? And do we have the right to do that? So those questions are all brought up and they are explored. But on top of that, he is looking at the idea of communication. He's looking at the idea of connection, right? And what it means to be a human being, to evolve as a human being, and yet to have this balance between isolation and connection. And obviously our characters are isolated, right? And they're in this pond. They can't get out of the pod because the environment, the atmosphere on this planet is too hostile. If they're even tried to open the hatch of their pod, they die instantly. So they are trapped in this claustrophobic pond, this claustrophobic vessel. Yet at the same time, the world they're in is this vast, desolate emptiness. And somehow he manages to balance this open-ended world that seems like it's full of nothing, like infinite nothing, and this really tight claustrophobic space at the same time. Because our characters are trapped inside this ball, and yet this pod, has infinite space to travel to before it can reach its goal or its destination, whatever that may be, he balances these two. And you constantly feel this push and pull between claustrophobia and having too much space, an infinite amount of space. And dichotomy is something he's playing with, So communication, what does it mean to be isolated versus what does it mean to be in constant communication? What is a result of communication and camaraderie? And are you able to communicate in such a way to dissolve your sense of self, but then to be part of a bigger whole? And what are the pros and cons when you can eschew any sort of personal identity for the benefit of the greater whole? And this idea of communication and of how to understand the self is something he is really, really playing with, especially as he's looking at the way the humans and the aliens understand each other and how they understand their own societies, their own communities. I think one of the joys and one of the kind of really humorous parts of this is that the humans and the aliens both think the other really dumb because they can't communicate. because communication is so important. And they're able to establish a very simple level of communication that isn't a communication that transmits meaning other than, like, we know you exist. They're able to emit a radio frequency signal that then can be repeated by the aliens, and then the aliens will make one that they repeat back. So they know there is some sort of level of cognition, but that's it. And when you get to the aliens just think that this dumb walking pod can grunt, but it can't do anything besides grunting. So they're so sympathetic for how dumb the stranger is and how utterly clueless and how poorly designed it is. And the humans look upon these aliens and they think the same thing, right? So this entire thing is due to a lack of communication. And now, of course, in this particular situation, our characters don't have the means to develop that communication, so it isn't their fault. But by taking a step back, you can look at how many obstacles we create for ourselves due to a lack of communication and a lack of trying to understand the perspective of the person we're trying to communicate with. How many of the problems that we experience in our lives, both on a personal level and a social level, are due to an inability to communicate in a meaningful and wholehearted way, and an inability to be empathetic and to understand the perspective, or even try to understand the perspective of the other side, whatever that other side may be. So that is something that is explored here, and it's explored with humor and with frustration, right? That both of these characters, the aliens and the humans, just feel so bad for the others because they think they're so dumb. Look at how dumb these things are. They can't do anything but grunt. So communication, connection between people or between species, interconnection, what it means to be isolated versus part of a group, what it means to try to balance dichotomies. These are all things that he's exploring, and he's exploring them quite explicitly. So the sections, right? The sections are all titled in these terms of dichotomies. So as I said, the chapters, if they're from the point of view of the humans, the chapters are just labeled light. And if they're from the point of view of the aliens, they're labeled darkness, right? But instead of having names, the character names, they're labeled light and darkness. And then the sections themselves also have these dichotomous names. So one section might be few, many, and the other one might be air and sea, and so forth. So the 7 sections each have a name or a title, but is a dichotomous pair, like this binary pair of opposites. And the thing is, due to the different characters, whether they're human or alien, their personal evolution, the way they relate to those binaries is different, right? So the way the aliens relate to darkness and the way the humans relate to light is the same, even though light and darkness are opposite. And the way our characters relate to individualism versus the way the aliens relate to collectivism is the same, even though obviously individualism and collectivism are opposites. So as a result of that, he's really exploring what it means to exist within dichotomies and to label yourself in one way or another. He's challenging your way of understanding the world. He's challenging what it means to be a member of society and to be an individual at the same time. And he's doing it through exploring the scientific evolution of these aliens due to the world he has built, right? Due to the environmental factors of this world, the aliens and their physiological and psychological makeup is a direct result of the world building he's done. And as a result of that world building, they're so wildly different than humans that they serve as a binary to the human mind. That is what he's exploring. And by doing that, you get a chance to look at yourself and how you exist in the world. So needless to say, I thought this was a great story. Now, my one complaint is I would have liked a little more character development. We have a very limited number of characters once we get onto the world, and they're all from one character's point of view. And due to the confines of our environment, this exploratory research pod that they're trapped in, and the roles they necessarily play in trying to survive, you don't see as much character development as I would have liked. By the time you get to the end of the story, it becomes apparent there has been a decent amount of character growth and development, but a lot of that was kind of silently happening in the background. And so you didn't see it quite as much on the page. And I understand it just because that isn't what the focus of the story is, that is all happening in the background. Personal evolution is happening in the background as the external forces of, this planet and all the obstacles are what you're trying to overcome. Both things aren't explicit at the same time. So I appreciate that. I understand it. I would have liked a little more depth into these characters. And that's hard when you're only going from one character's point of view. Your perspective is necessarily limited, which is why the alien sections, the chapters where you get the point of view of the aliens, is really refreshing, but it still doesn't give you any insight into our main characters' emotions or how they exist in the world. So I would have liked a little more character development on the page. But even then, even with that mild complaint, I think the world building and the way the world building and the writing and the pacing all work together, and the way all those are used to explore these ideas of communication, of personal identity, how ideas of dualism work, and how you exist as one and many at the same time, if that's possible. And these ideas all are a direct result of the world building. The way everything is integrated in that way, I think, is incredibly skillful and a joy to read. That's the most important part. It is a joy to read. And the obstacles he creates for our characters, you really feel that there is genuine peril. And it never feels forced. It always feels genuine. It feels relaxed. It feels comfortable given the world that he's built. So there doesn't feel like there's any Deus Ex Machina happening. And because of that, I really dug this story. I had a great time with it. I think it's asking some really important questions, but it's doing it through a veneer of science and through a veneer of engaging with alien life forms. And because of that, it is a mirror on what it means to be part of human community in ways that is really important and really meaningful. So I had a great time with this novel. I think you will too. If you like horror novels, if you like sci-fi, it does lean into hard science a little bit, and it doesn't have a lot of on-the-page character development. So if hard science is something that is a little bit iffy for you, and if character development on the page is really, really an important part of your reading experience, then this may come off as a little cold for you. But if you like strong writing, if you like really good plotting, if you like a good survival horror story that feels like it has real stakes and is making bold claims about humanity in general, then I think this is a wonderful book for you to pick up. And I hope you do, and I hope you have a great time with it. With that, that is all I'm going to say today. I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, especially if there's any other survival horror that you really appreciate. I'd love to get some recommendations for that. And if there's anything else by Tchaikovsky that you really enjoy, what is that and why do you like it so much? You know, that's what I really want to know. Because as I read more and more Tchaikovsky, I'd like to find out what it is about his writing and about his world building and characters that people are so drawn to. So I'd love to hear your opinions down below. But for now, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.